So I wanted to explain what I meant last week when I said, "Ooh, next week, make sure you come back. It's the really cool stuff." That sounds strange because last week we were building and we were focused on the women in the Female Anti-Slavery Society, and a lot was happening with the formation of William Lloyd Garrison's movement and the Liberators' founding in Boston. And that we covered pretty much 20 years, maybe 25 years. And now I'm saying we've just got 10 years to cover this week, and it's the really cool stuff. I didn't mean to denigrate all that we learned last week. It was really cool and exciting too. But what I mean is, and those of you who know what goes on in Concord and Boston and the entire country during the 1850s know already, it's very dramatic, fast-paced, sensational time. And because Concord is now much more yoked to the excitement that's going on in Boston, it becomes a much more dramatic, fast-paced, frenetic time for these people that you met last week. Last week, we focused a little bit more on Ralph Waldo Emerson to the exclusion of Thoreau, because Thoreau was at Walden and writing Civil Disobedience by the end of what we talked about last week, but still quite a young man and occasionally working with his family as an abolitionist. This week, we're going to switch that, and I'm going to tell you from the start that Ralph Waldo Emerson, now that Mary Merrick Brooks has lit that fire under him, and he is now in the abolitionist camp, at least to some extent, he becomes much more active throughout the 1850s, delivers anti-slavery speeches repeatedly, especially denouncing the fugitive slave law. But it's Thoreau that I'm going to spend time on this week as his arc sort of radicalizes as well. So that's background, and we'll move forward. Did the slide advance? Can somebody just nod for me? Good, making sure that I'm on track here. So I told you at the end of our conversation last week that the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 would change the dynamics of everything that was happening throughout the country, but also certainly in Concord and in Boston. This law, for the very first time since the Constitutional Convention at least, had brought the arm of the federal government and its legislative power and enforcement provisions to the support of slavery. When I used to teach this kind of material in my American Lit and American Studies class, I think students were always incredibly surprised to find out that the system of slavery in this country was legislated by states, not by the federal government. That's why we had northern states that had abolished it and were free states versus slave states largely in the South. It's also why slave laws, enslaved people were governed very differently depending on whether you were in Georgia or South Carolina or Virginia or Maryland. Things could be quite different for you. The Fugitive Slave Law changed a lot of that. One thing it did from the beginning was negate personal liberty laws. So a lot of northern states throughout the late 1700s and throughout the entire antebellum era had passed laws that allowed their state to defy the fugitive slave clause that had allowed Southerners to come north into free states and retrieve their, quote, human property. The passage of those personal liberty laws had meant that couldn't happen. State and local law enforcement could not be compelled by the enslaver in their assistance. The Fugitive Slave Law overturns that. It absolutely reverses it. And the provision of this law meant that state, local, law enforcement units, the governor of a state, judges who were turned into slave commissioners, they would all be forced to assist, brought into the assistance of the enslaver in locating and arresting any of their formerly enslaved people who had made it to a free state. Anyone who assisted black African American friend, neighbor, to leave the situation they were in and to defy their capture was subject to a fine of what today would be over $40,000 and or a jail term of 6 months. Not something that most Northerners or anyone else could afford to do. What a lot of historians and critics who still talk about the fact that abolitionists in the North started caring about slavery once it arrived in their backyards after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, to a certain extent, that's fair enough criticism. It doesn't mean that they weren't committed before, doesn't mean that their commitment only rested on their own ability to be part of the system. But it's certainly true that we have much more abolitionist activity and enforcement and resistance after it was absolutely something that they were going to be compelled to be a part of. So I say all of that in background to introducing you to what happened in Concord and who were the people and how do we know that made this happen. I've got a lot of stuff to talk to you about tonight, and forgive me from the beginning if I talk rather quickly or if there are slides I just don't spend a lot of time on, because I'm aware of where we need to get by the end of the conversation, and then to allow plenty of time for Q&A. So if you don't quite get something that I say too quickly, or if I skipped something that's really important about a particular subject, then by all means, please bring it back during the questions and we can cover that. And if I didn't say this already, I think I did last week, but Zach has these slides. So if there's an image you want to have a copy of or to ask a question about, he can certainly provide those to you. As you can see, except for the item in the first December 1846 to January 47, all of the rest of the documented cases that we know about of Underground Railroad activity in Concord occurred after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was passed. We know about all of these situations, with one exception, because of private writings that were not published. What that says to me, as someone who is dying to know more about this story, is that there are probably many more diaries, letters, journals, unpublished materials that simply haven't been located or haven't been brought to light. So my guess is that there was a lot more than these situations of Underground Railroad activity and people who were aided in their escape in Concord, but this is what I've found, and we don't know yet about the others. We know about John from both Abigail Alcott and Bronson Alcott's journals, as well as a letter that Abigail Alcott wrote to her brother. The other situations are from journals and letters, as well as late reminiscences, I guess I would call them, from abolitionists who looked back on what they did during this era and wrote about it at that time. October 1854, the last person listed here, I say purportedly taken to a Mr. Allen, and that's because despite all the research I did at the time, I could not locate anything that actually gave evidence to support what Austin Burse, a man from the Vigilance Committee, said they had done on that particular night. So I've got two individuals who supposedly helped him bring this person to someone named Mr. Allen in Concord, but that's all I have for you on that one. The others we'll talk more about. Why did those people come to Concord? What brought the Underground Railroad activity to bear in Concord was largely a matter of the Boston Vigilance Committee having Concord members, a couple at least, one of whom was a neighbor of Henry Thoreau. His name was William Whiting. George Minot was also a member. And for a few years, at least in the beginning of the committee's activity, Bronson Alcott was listed among their members. As you can see, just by looking at these few men, and it was a large organization, over 200 members at any one time, the organization had actually been organized in the 1840s. Its purpose, it had, an extensive mission statement, but, the short story of their mission statement is that they existed as a group whose job was to monitor any incoming people to Boston who were escaping their enslavement. They provided them with food, housing, clothing. Many times there were families involved. It wasn't just a single man or woman. And then they aided them until they decided they needed to leave the city, or assisted them also, those who determined to stay, in finding employment. As you can see, it's a biracial organization from the start. This is only a handful, of course, of the 200 and some members, but this is a handful of some of the most active members, especially those who really turned things into a higher gear after 1850. This was an organization that was composed of both the Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison wing of abolitionists, meaning that they were largely pacifists after his example, but after 1850, especially, these men and others determined that they were willing to use armed resistance if needed to assist the people they were planning to help. I didn't mean to do that yet, so we'll go back to the other slide. The man on the left is Lewis Hayden, one of my personal heroes. We'll be talking about him later. He had escaped his own enslavement from Kentucky, along with his second wife and child, and I believe her mother as well. They were in Detroit for a time and then ended up in Boston. Next to him is Wendell Phillips, whom you met last week. On over, moving to the right, is William Wells Brown, considered by many to be the first African-American novelist. And next to him on the far right is Austin Burse from Cape Cod, whose job was really providing aid to the people coming in by boat to Boston Harbor and escaping from a southern state. And his job then was helping them get on out of Boston when needed, up to Canada and other parts. Down in the bottom left corner next to Lewis Hayden is Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He's older here than he was at the time of the Boston Vigilance Committee days. You may know him as one of the first co-editors of Emily Dickinson's poetry. You may also know Higginson as the colonel of the first African-American unit in South Carolina to fight in the Union, to fight with the Union in the Civil War. Moving on to the right, we have Theodore Parker, Unitarian minister, whose congregation was huge in Boston. And he was really the executive director of this re-energized Vigilance Committee and one of the most committed to armed resistance for the fugitive slaves whom they helped. Next to him is a very successful African-American caterer in Boston. His name is Joshua Smith. So again, these are, a handful of the probably 24 or more very active, what I would say, the extremists of the Boston Vigilance Committee during the 1850s. Moving to their activity, I want to focus just for a few minutes on the most sensational, the most talked about fugitive slave cases that occurred in Boston as a result of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. All of these connected to Concord in some way, some much more specifically and directly than others. The first instance of resistance and attempted capture after the Fugitive Slave Law passed was this couple, William and Ellen Craft. They had actually escaped from far South Georgia in Macon in the Christmas holidays of 1848, made it all the way to Philadelphia and then on to Boston, where abolitionists in Philadelphia told them they would probably be safer if they went further north. Their book about their escape, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, is a great one to teach. It wasn't published until just on the cusp of the Civil War. But as you can see here from the two images, the very light-complected Ellen disguised herself as a man who was frail, bandaged, and seeking assistance from a specialty doctor in Philadelphia. She was attended during their escape by her husband, or by her real husband, but disguised as her enslaved man, helping him during their entire journey up to Philadelphia. They made it. It's an exciting book. I encourage you to read it, and those of you who teach, to teach it if you haven't been already. But they are connected to Concord because as soon as the fugitive slave law passed in 1850, their freedom and their enjoyable life in Boston was threatened because it was very well known that this couple was in Boston. And so because of the news press, they had been speaking everywhere. And so they were immediately under suspicion and imperiled. Their former owner in Georgia immediately sent agents to capture both of them and bring them, quote, home in October 1850. They had, however, spoken in Concord, and we know that only because two women in the Anti-Slavery Society wrote about them coming to Concord to speak in March 1849. One of those women was Prudence Ward and Maria Thoreau, writing back and forth to each other. The other one was actually Henry Thoreau's sister, Sophia, writing to a cousin in Maine. So otherwise, we would have no idea that this couple ever came to Concord. And I know that if you're sitting there and you investigated letters and you know the treats that reveal themselves to us in letters like this, you're probably saying, okay, so those letters let you know that this couple came to speak in Concord. Did Thoreau say anything about seeing them? Did Emerson go to see them? No and no. I have no idea if they went to see them, but neither of these men left any record in a letter or a journal, at least that we know of. I know certainly that Sophia Thoreau went to see them. I know that Mary Brooks did, and I know that Maria Thoreau was there in the audience as well. But whether or not either of the two abolitionist transcendentalist authors, wow, sorry about that. I have no idea how that happened. I'm hitting a button that I don't mean to be hitting, clearly. I'm very sorry. Let me get back where we were. There we are. They left no record, our transcendentalists, to my knowledge. So again, every now and then I'm going to throw things out that I'd still love to know that I didn't find when I was doing this work. And so if anyone else has the ability to uncover this kind of information, please let us know. Keep working on it. The next, wow, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I'm hitting. Oh. All right, I must have a scroll button on that I don't know about. Let's see if I just start doing something else with a different button. You're now looking at Shadrach Minkins, 1851. That's where we should be. Good, that's what you've got. My apologies. Shadrach Minkins occurred in February 1851. He had been in Boston working for a while, comfortably, young man, doing all right, but again, was subject to arrest as soon as the fugitive slave law passed. So in this period of time, he was arrested. And his is the sensational story of the group I'm talking about because he was actually spirited to Concord during his escape, and his story is success. Just like the Crafts, who did manage to, not to be caught, they were separated. One of the abolitionists took care of Ellen, the other of William, until the plans were hatched that they were able to get the two of them out of the country entirely. And they actually ended up in England, where they stayed until the Civil War ended. Shadrach Minkins was actually arrested and in the Boston courthouse after his hearing and waiting for guards to take him to a jail cell when the abolitionists on the street had already gotten word of the fact that a black man was being held on suspicion of the new law, and they needed to do something. What could they do? Lewis Hayden shows up, and other black abolitionists and Vigilance Committee members with him, and there's no other way to describe it in every story that talks about this situation as the fact that these abolitionists moved into the courtroom just as the hearing ended and just bodily lifted Shadrach Minkins up and down the stairs of the courthouse, and he disappeared, spirited him away, is the way one abolitionist describes it, on the streets of Beacon Hill, which was the popular neighborhood then for African Americans. He must have been moved from house to house, street to street. Certainly, law enforcement was out looking for him, but the decision was made sometime that evening that the best route to get him to safety was to go to Concord, Massachusetts. That tells us a lot. Just the fact that the route used to move Shadrach Minkins most safely out of Boston was west and through Concord. This shows us how tight the relationships had become between Concord abolitionists and the Boston Vigilance Committee leaders. So Lewis Hayden and John Smith, another Black Vigilance Committee member, put Shadrach Minkins in a wagon that was lent to them by the man they were visiting or staying with and hiding with at that time in Cambridge. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, Ann Bigelow, who lived right across from the Concord Free Public Library's location now, answered the door. And there the three black men were asking for help. They come into the house. She wakes her husband. She also runs across the street where her neighbor, Mary Merrick Brooks, conveniently lived. And she and her husband come over. And the group of people sit there trying to decide as they get some food and some courage together for their visitors and try to decide what is the best course of action here? Where do we take him, and how is he going to get on the right train? A few days from now, they decided to make it to Canada. It was decided that they would take him to Leominster, a little bit further west yet from Concord, and there stay with the Mary Merrick Brooks of Leominster, a woman named Frances Drake, and she and her husband, Jonathan, took care of and hid Shadrach for a few more days. He does end up in Canada. So the first two trials of the fugitive slave law in Boston were incredible successes for the abolitionists that absolutely angered, of course, the federal government, the President of the United States, the Congress. It also upset Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, who had supported, to the great dismay of the Boston abolitionists and the state anti-slavery sympathizers, even of the moderate wing, who had elected him. And so the next two cases that affected Concord that came through Boston were not nearly as successful. Then we got a man named Thomas Sims. Thomas Sims basically is arriving in Boston Harbor on a ship just as Shadrach Minkins is leaving. Unfortunately, his situation will not end as well. Thomas Sims has come all the way from Georgia and managed to stay hidden and out of sight on the ship he's on for the 2 weeks or so that it took him to get there. The law enforcement and legislative leaders in Boston at this time are absolutely not going to allow this freeing efforts to keep them from doing their job and passing the fugitive slave law, making it successful in Boston. They're not going to allow it to happen again. So security is much tighter. The Vigilance Committee is trying to figure out ways to rescue Thomas Sims, who is being held in a cell in the Boston courthouse. And they end up putting, law enforcement puts bars on the window of the courthouse, of the jail cell that he's in, when they get wind of the fact that a rescue attempt is going to be attempted. This is connected to Concord primarily because Concord's new Trinitarian minister is a man named Reverend Daniel Foster, and he is about as radical as you can get. And his journal is filled with anger and hostility over what's been happening in Boston over the last year. And he runs to offer the Vigilance Committee all support that he can. When it's finally realized that Thomas Sims is going to be returned to Georgia and enslavement, he's the one at Boston Harbor at the ship as Thomas Sims is put aboard, offering the prayer to the Vigilance Committee on behalf of the Vigilance Committee. Thoreau is very good friends with Daniel Foster, as is his sister with Foster's wife, Dora. And Thoreau starts journal entries at this time during Thomas Sims's imprisonment and then his return to slavery. And these journal entries, along with those dealing with our next fugitive slave in Boston, Anthony Burns, those journal entries will be what we talk about in just a moment, that become the actual text of Thoreau's Slavery in Massachusetts. Anthony Burns then is 3 years later. So Boston was relatively calm when it came to the fugitive slave law for a few years. Anthony Burns, however, becomes the example that will lead Boston finally to make a committed effort to never allow this situation to happen in the city again. And so Burns will be actually the last of the enslaved people to be returned to his condition of enslavement from the city of Boston. I put this slide in here real quickly just to back up to Shadrach for just a moment, because what Anne Bigelow says here applies to the entire operations of the Underground Railroad in Concord, as well as anything that was done, whether that was a speech or, Underground Railroad activity or actual leadership of any sort. She's making the very important point, which we talked about a little bit last week, that it's the women, especially the Anti-Slavery Society women, who are free from obeying the fugitive slave law or any other law. It's men like Mary's husband, Nathan Brooks. It's Ralph Waldo Emerson, the illustrious, renowned men of the community who have reputations and careers that they have to worry about. She's very proud, of course, as an elderly woman, giving these reminiscences of the success she remembers the women having on this subject. But I think what she says here is instructive and important for us to remember when some of us think, how did these women organize and get this stuff done? They didn't have any power. Well, what is power? Where does power come from? They certainly did have it, especially when they bonded together and, used those connections with nearby Boston for all they were worth as well. 1854, when Anthony Burns is arrested in the city of Boston, is a propitious and very dramatic year. The United States Congress has just passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which has overturned the unsteady compromise of 1820. Where are all these territories in the West going to, how are they going to come into the Union once they come in as states? Are they going to come in as slave states, as Texas did? Are they going to come in as free states? The 1820 Missouri Compromise would have said that those north of the latitude 3630 line, which is basically a straight line across the middle of the country, would have come in free. Those below the line, slave. That was no longer going to be the case once the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. That law turned it over to what was, derogatorily called squatter sovereignty. The ballot box would establish whether a state was going to be slave or free. As a result, enslavers from southern states started pouring into those territories, often bringing their enslaved people with them to try and overpopulate the states with enough slave supporting votes that Kansas, Nebraska, the whole western area would be slave states. As a result of trying to offset that, Northerners sent out immigrant aid trains, people, abolitionists, trying to keep that from happening. What I tell students is that what you really get in the mid-1850s in Kansas is a miniature civil war playing out. And Concord's involved in it because they are raising money and sewing and doing all the things that women abolitionists were doing throughout northern territories and states in trying to fund and send supplies and arms to Kansas. At the same time, in May 1854, you've got American and Massachusetts anti-slavery societies holding their annual meetings. So you've got this incendiary cocktail happening just in one couple of week period of May 1854 in Boston. The Kansas-Nebraska Act has just passed. The anti-slavery societies are meeting. And then, as I've told you, May 26, Anthony Burns had been arrested. His trial lasted for 2 weeks. And so during that time, what we have on the streets of Boston at this time is Anthony Burns being arrested, held in jail, 2 weeks of a trial. And you've got a far bigger crowd, of course, of abolitionists on the streets of Boston for these 2 weeks than you would normally have. You've got the state and the national abolitionist societies meeting. And so everything is being done to try and free Anthony Burns, who's being held in jail, just as Thomas Sims had been in the Boston courthouse. A rescue attempt is very famously made to rescue Anthony Burns on, I believe it was the night of May 27th, and you can read 2 or 3 books on this subject. It was led by all of those men who were on the former slide of the Vigilance Committee. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But when they broke into the courthouse, one of the courthouse guards was killed. The minute that kind of noise and violence and melee occurred, then the entire rescue effort just really stopped and broke up. Bronson Alcott was apparently there on the scene after the rescue attempt was made, but he famously got in at least on some of that action. So Concord was well informed of what was happening in this situation. Henry David Thoreau's journal was going crazy during these weeks. He, as you can see in the pages here, just a couple of pages of the journal, he had been writing about the Anthony Burns situation from the minute he heard about it. The first journal entry, I think, takes place on June 2nd, so just a few days after the arrest. By this time, Thoreau and Thomas Wentworth Higginson were pretty good friends. Higginson lived in Worcester and was friends with some of Thoreau's friends, so he had been there to speak. They talked about natural history together, and when Thoreau found out Higginson was among those who had tried to rescue Anthony Burns, he's even more upset. A little bit angry too at himself. I think some of these entries make that clear, that he wishes he had been on the scene to indulge some of his own resistance effort at the time. He's absolutely raking over the coals. The legislators in Massachusetts, the press, anyone in New England that had anything to do with actually complying with this law. What I love about Thoreau's journal entries when it comes to John Brown and Anthony Burns especially is that you can see how the the political, the anti-slavery diatribe and anger and passages fit right in with the natural history. The page on the left, I know you can't read this, but were you to enlarge it, you would be able to see it's just one plant after another. What's blooming on June 16th? What's coming into bloom on June 2nd? What birds have arrived, and just everything related to the natural history that Thoreau is paying attention to, that we know him to care about. And then right here, the first red arrow on the left, he says, these days it is left to a Mr. Loring to decide whether a man is not really a man or a slave. Loring is the slave commissioner who presided over the trial of Anthony Burns for 2 weeks and then made the decision that he was indeed the, quote, property of a man named Charles Suttle in Virginia, and rendered him back to Suttle's custody. Thoreau actually names Anthony Burns, so he's clearly aware of what it is that's happening. These journal entries continue. My thoughts are murder to the state, he says. And then in what you can't see, but there's some pencil in here in between the lines, I'm calculating how many miscreants each honest man can dispose of. Remember where we were at the end of last week with civil disobedience. I quietly declare war with the state. Remember that? Quietly declare war with the state. We've moved. 5 years later, we've moved. His thoughts are murder to the state. Quite a big step forward, I would say, for Thoreau. We finish My Thoughts Are Murder to the State, and we go right back into natural history and little drawings of the tracks that the muskrat and other creatures leave that he's trying to replicate. And then there's this journal entry just a few days later, July 4th, 8 a.m. to Framingham, little town south of Concord. Except Thoreau doesn't tell us anything about what he's going to Framingham to do, why he's going to Framingham so darn early in the morning. And instead, he's then going to talk to us about the yellow lily and other plants. Well, what he doesn't tell us is that there's an anti-slavery rally happening, Massachusetts State anti-slavery rally, at Framingham that day. And Harmony Grove was the amphitheater area park where it was held. And the purpose of the rally that day, as William Lloyd Garrison opened it, was to vent all the hostility and anger and rage that the abolitionists had at this time over the return of Anthony Burns to slavery. It was a hot, hot day. Sojourner Truth was there to speak, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, and two men from Concord, William Whiting, Thoreau's neighbor, and Henry Thoreau himself. The only time that we're aware of that he actually spoke on a public stage as a representative or with an organized rally by an anti-slavery organization. He was not among those figures named ahead of time. If you look at the announcements for the day's rally, you get the big figures, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, a few other names, and then you get etc. And so Henry Thoreau can be considered one of the et ceteras who was there to speak that day, which I find really appealing. The speech is certainly coming almost entirely from his journal entries. So a lot of the mess we were looking at on those journal pages a while ago is his pencil rearranging and revising and editing his own prose as he's working to turn the rough journal entries into a more coherent, rhetorically sophisticated speech for an audience. One of the things that's really significant about this speech is the way in which he does really move the rhetorical order of his journal's comments into the speech. He really creates here a transcendentalist speech out of the political anger and hostility. And he is doing the most perfect job I think he's probably ever done in showing us the value of the transcendentalist belief in using nature as a symbolic, a symbolic way to envision the ideal. And so if you know anything about water lilies on lakes or in rivers, the bloom is on the surface, of course, and then the long stem is going all the way down to the muck and the slime of the riverbed. And that's what he is telling us in this very famous passage, is that I'm going to believe in the nation's ability to effect justice out of this muck and slime of slavery, because nature tells me that we can do this. And if nature can do it, I'm going to derive some sustenance and belief for humans as well. Really a lovely passage. In the speech, the white lily passage comes at the end of the speech, and it follows my thoughts are murder to the state. It's in a completely different order in his journal. So it's interesting to me, if you're interested in this, to go back and read the journal passages on slavery in Massachusetts and then read the speech. You'll see things that occurred to him in kind of a different way, as far as the way he wanted to present his thoughts to an audience. We need to move on and get to what remains here, but I do want to make you aware that even though he was returned to his enslavement in Virginia, abolitionists had been trying to raise enough money to have purchased Anthony Burns's freedom while he was still in Boston. They did manage to do that in a way that was at least, a sum and in a process that his enslaver would accept. And so in 1855, just a few months after his re-enslavement, he was freed and ended up in Oberlin College in Ohio, the liberal arts school that's still there, I think, the first in the nation to accept both women and African Americans. Later went on to Canada, where he was a minister for a few years. We are now looking at a second generation of women working in the anti-slavery trenches with their mothers. Ellen Garrison, those of you who are going to Concord and going to have the tour later this year, will no doubt go to the Robbins house, where you'll meet members of the Garrison family. But you'll remember last week meeting Susan Garrison. Her daughter Ellen was actually almost a teenager by the time the Female Society was founded in 1837. So she was very early in working with the women in Concord, and then did the same in Boston. Ellen's life story is absolutely inspiring, and we don't have time to spend a lot with her this week, but I encourage you to find out all that you can about her when you go to Concord and tour the Robbins house. You can also learn more just at their website. She ends up teaching freed people in 3 different states and on behalf of different organizations. Ends up in Kansas, ends up in California. It's really a very inspiring life. 2 other young women, again, working with their mothers and neighbors with the Anti-Slavery Society. This is the eldest of the Alcott girls, telling her father that they're still pro-slavery families in town, and it's the Alcott girls who are going to uphold the anti-slavery message. Ellen Emerson talking about her excitement of being involved in sewing societies and the family's hosting of abolitionists in their home in Concord, and how she's even come to starting to feel that a civil war would be something to welcome, a sentiment that her mother certainly did not join her in, at least not at that time. The poster in the middle is advertising a drama on behalf of the Anti-Slavery Society, and this was Louisa May Alcott's contribution to the Anti-Slavery Society, to write amateur theatricals that the young people in town would perform, proceeds going to fund the abolitionists. Harriet Tubman visited Concord at least 3 or 4 times. We know that she spoke once in the First Church vestry. She was there to fundraise during the war. She was there on a couple of clothing drives, to benefit the people in the communities that she had begun supporting, and where she had actually brought some of the people that she was successful in getting out of their enslavement in both New York and in Canada. I like to show this image because I think most of us have seen it now, but remember last week when I showed you the new photos that had just come to my attention anyway, and I think to most, of Mary Merrick Brooks. That's same is true with Harriet Tubman. This is a photo we see often now, but it was only, quote, discovered, brought to light in 2017, I think it was, just not even 10 years ago. It turned up in a collection with some new letters of Frederick Douglass. So, don't ever throw those trunks of letters in your relatives' attics out. You have no idea what might be in there. This brings us to the last dramatic moment, and I'm sorry, it's nearly 8 o'clock, so I'm going to have to go pretty quickly here, but we can come back to John Brown with your questions. I find it really telling of all we've been talking about as far as the anti-slavery women's leadership in Concord of this effort. It's thanks to them that John Brown himself first came to Concord in March 1857. They had asked Frank Sanborn, the local schoolmaster who was known to Brown and a part of the effort, the Free Kansas effort, they had asked him to please issue an invitation to John Brown to visit Concord because they knew that Brown was in Boston. He did that in March 1857 for the first time, met Thoreau and Emerson at that time, and then he was back in Concord for his last birthday, as it turned out, turning 60 there before moving on to Harper's Ferry in October. Frank Sanborn, whom I've just mentioned, is the young man on the right. He's an older guy over to the left. This is a group of 6 abolitionists, mainly in Boston, who supported financially, but more through consciousness raising and back support of what John Brown had described to them he was planning to do in the Eastern Appalachians, to try and arm groups, small groups of African-American formerly enslaved men, to just slowly arm communities up and down what he called the Great Black Way, that would slowly be divisive enough and instill enough terror in the whites and enslavers' properties that they would just decide that it wasn't worth it anymore. Sort of naive, as we might have called William Lloyd Garrison's moral suasion, but at this point, everything was being considered a possible way to thwart the institution of slavery. This is George Stearns. To the right, Garrett Smith, a wealthy man who had a lot of property in New York and had, in fact, given John Brown some property there so that he had already begun sort of forming a small militia and training African Americans in New York. This is Thomas Wentworth Higginson in the middle, different picture. Theodore Parker, bottom left. Next to him, Samuel Gridley Howe. Again, so-called Secret Six. We could just as easily have the Secret Seven, 8 and 9, add Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and a couple of others, because these were not the only men who were supporting what John Brown was planning to do. These are the Harper's Ferry Raiders, so-called. These are the 22 men who with Brown, planned to raid the federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. If you're looking pretty astutely, you notice a couple of women in the middle of the group, and no, they were not part of the Harpers Ferry raiders. They were, however, very important parts of the Harpers Ferry subterfuge. This is Brown's daughter-in-law, Martha, married to Oliver Brown, who was one of the casualties at Harpers Ferry. And then in the bottom, this is Annie Brown, John's daughter. At that time, she was about 16. Brown asked both of them to come from the home in New York and live with him and the men in the farmhouse in Maryland that they lived in for the few months prior to Harper's Ferry, because he knew they needed legitimizing. They needed the cover of really being the surveyor that he was, the farmer that he was, moving in and out all the time, bringing weapons under a covered wagon, and then amassing all these different men on the property. The black men who were with the group, 5 of them, certainly moved around only in darkness. And remember, Maryland's a slave state, so there's certainly not being that visible. But still, there were nosy neighbors coming over and asking questions and wanting to know, why so much laundry hanging on the wire, and why so many different people, and your dad seems to come and go. And so it was the ability of these women, Martha and Annie, to sort of make things look, okay. Legitimate to the neighbors who were wondering what was going on. He was renting this farmhouse in Maryland, and you can still go there today and tour it. I have many times with students on field trips. They moved in there in July, and Harper's Ferry takes place in October. So they were there throughout the summer months. It is very small, so you wonder, how did 20 men and 2 women survive there? Very small inside as well. The men largely slept up in the attic space. The home is privately owned, but it's run as a museum, and you can certainly get in touch with the owner and go there and see it if you're ever in the area. It's about 1.5 miles from maybe a little bit more than that, from the Harpers Ferry and West Virginia border now. When Harpers Ferry occurred in October, the middle of October, 1859, it was immediate news. It was immediate, today we wouldn't say fake news, but we'd say false news, incorrect news. They thought John Brown was dead. He wasn't. They thought that no one survived. That wasn't true either. So the abolitionists immediately got into high gear of trying to find out what had happened, what could we do, what did they need, what should our role be here in this moment. Concord was especially, of course, interested in the situation because Brown had just been there. They felt he was a friend as well as this sensational national figure whose efforts they supported for the most part. Few differences of opinion among the abolitionists, however. Garrison is never going to call anything that has violence attached to it a reasonable course of action. Nathaniel Hawthorne is always anti-abolitionist, so he's not going to think it was a good thing. Ralph Waldo Emerson, however, quotes another abolitionist and says probably one of the most incredibly courageous and risky lines that Ralph Waldo Emerson may have ever said. This was very, very scary kind of rhetoric coming from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thoreau will say things that are very similar, calling Brown a Christ-like figure, an angel of light. Frederick Douglass is going to support anything John Brown does, although he had the opportunity to be at Harper's Ferry and did not want to participate in the activity. Abolitionist Lydia Maria Child speaks for many of the anti-slavery women. And Harriet Tubman is completely supportive. She was meant to have been there at Harper's Ferry with Brown, had said she would join it, thought it was a decent proposal and a strategy that could have succeeded. She was with sick family in New York at the time, however, or New Bedford, might have been in Massachusetts, I'm forgetting, and was not able to be there. Henry Thoreau's journal looked pretty messy 5 years earlier for slavery in Massachusetts. This is what it looks like now. He tells us he is so incensed by what has happened with John Brown and by all the mistaken, crazy reports in the press about him that he slept with his pencil under his pillow. He had to awaken constantly to be able to write. He was so upset. For the first time ever that I can think of in a Henry Thoreau journal entry, he says that nature does not hold the delight for him. He is not able to enjoy his walks so much as John Brown with him. Just as he did with slavery in Massachusetts, you see the journal's prose also being reworked here. He's already sure he's going to work this language into a speech. He's so upset. And so he does. He delivers his first of 3 speeches on John Brown, a plea for Captain John Brown 3 times in Concord, in Boston, and in Worcester. And he is not trying to justify what happened at Harper's Ferry or to talk about all the things that Brown is accused of doing in Kansas. He is, as he says, going to talk about the character of the man who would do such a thing as try to instill, to begin a revolution on behalf of the enslaved 4 million people. He has moved quite a ways, we have to see, from quietly declaring war with the state 10 years before to thoughts that were murder to the state 5 years before. We're now at the point where Thoreau is saying, okay, I can see myself, I can see doing exactly what Brown did. Had the opportunity presented itself, I could have been there doing this. I'll bring it to an end now and just leave you with this question real quickly. If you don't know what Henry Thoreau was doing in the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1859, you should know that he was doing something far more risky, far more law-breaking than he ever imagined doing with a night in jail. He was helping a wanted man with a $500 bounty on his head escape from Concord, Massachusetts to South Acton, where he got on a train and ensured that this man got to Canada safely, which he did. There is no way that Henry Thoreau didn't know what he was doing, that he didn't know he was breaking the law, and that he probably would have been arrested and perhaps even put on trial and, who knows, executed himself as an accomplice to the escape or assisting in the escape of a raider from Harper's Ferry. How that occurred is a long, wonderful, lovely story, and we can come back to it if you have questions. I give the last word on John Brown to Abigail Alcott. I think she nails it, that, it's the governor of Virginia who lets John Brown have access to reporters for the 6 weeks that he's sitting in jail before he's executed. And he gave speech after speech and interview after interview, and certainly spread that abolitionist message time and again to people who were listening and reading. More drama in Concord, that's all later. Mary Merrick Brooks doesn't write as many letters in the 1850s, unfortunately, but we do have a few. We think of Concord as an anti-slavery hotbed, thanks to the great speeches and brilliant rhetorical abolitionism of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They have taught us about accepting the moral imperative. They've taught us to follow the higher law, to pursue justice, to consider and think about the kind of life we want to live. But when it comes to how the Transcendentalists enacted social reform, it wasn't just these two men. If we've learned anything over the last 2 weeks, we've learned that it was a community of committed people, neighbors, family members, and especially women who taught Thoreau and Emerson that the way to accept the responsibility of their reputations was to speak and to connect with everyone who was the like-minded abolitionists in Concord in their own home, in their own community. And I'll leave you with the words of your own leader, asking you, how is that transcendentalist connection? How is that social justice impetus occurring today? 2026 isn't 1859 or 1860 or 1837 when the events we've been talking about occurred, but it's absolutely still a time, maybe even an incredible time, for the kind of public action that these people were modeling for us. What can they teach us today? And certainly, I think it's a great deal.